Hello, I'm URI Professor Vince Petronio. Welcome to part 2 of TEDxURI, Decoding the Language of Climate. Tonight, you will hear from another set of amazing presenters and performers who will share their language of climate change. We have a doctor, a visual artist, a violinist, a philosopher, and more. Now, if you didn't have a chance to see part 1, we encourage you to go back and watch it after tonight's show. Enjoy.
Welcome to something special. Welcome to TEDx. This TEDx event is part of a global conversation that takes place every day in every corner of the world. In schools, in theaters, in workplaces, even in prisons. People gather to hear the best ideas bubbling up in their communities. More than 3,000 TEDx events are held every year in 170 countries. It's a remarkable thing. TEDx events are self-organized under a license from TED, a non-profit organization devoted to discovering and sharing powerful ideas in the form of TED Talks. It's not TED itself, but your local TEDx team of volunteers that has done all the work to put on today's event, including booking all of the speakers. It's this team's ideas, dedication, and time that have made this possible. We really hope today's program sparks an exciting conversation. This is a day for curiosity and for skepticism, for inspiration and for action. The more you enter into it, the more you will take out. And now, on with the show.
Ryan Campos is a multi-instrumentalist sound artist who has engineered and produced a range of audio works for a variety of collaborative pieces. Best known for his ambient sound design and generative composition, his work focuses on the studies of immersive soundscaping, as well as the relation between sound and feeling. Outside of the studio, Ryan performs live using modular synthesis, inviting listeners to take a deeper look into the sound. There is no single solution to solving climate change. So we must take risks with bold experiments to learn our way into the future. Jan Sedzimir, a systems ecologist, comes to us from Vienna. He's worked with teams of scientists and lay people, participatory science, to help local communities and nations address the risk and uncertainty from unpredictable change. Jan will speak to you about how we must fundamentally restructure society to become carbon neutral. A massive effort that requires our society to unite as effectively as it did in World War II to reverse society's polarization and reestablish trust in working together.
Hi, I'm Jan Sedzimir, a New Englander who's lived and worked all over the world, from Africa to Asia to Europe to the United States. I've worked as a Zen Buddhist and I've worked as an ecologist on issues of how do we face great uncertainty. I've tried with my science to unite non-scientists and scientists in coming to understand these problems together. Zen Buddhism and ecology might sound very different, but actually, you might be surprised at the ways they could complement each other in dealing with the major dilemma of climate change. That dilemma is that we are not learning fast enough now in order to adapt to the changes coming our way. Climate change is starting to come on so strong, it's starting to terrify people. It's really almost like God knocking at the door, the way Beethoven introduced the Sixth Symphony. It might really look like God knocking on the door if the entire landscape is chasing you from your home, whether it's drought or flooding, sea level rise in Miami, or can you imagine having to leave your home on 5 minutes' notice, drive like crazy through walls of fire, and cringe on the beach waiting for your Navy to rescue you? Australians don't have to imagine it, they're living it. And they're starting to say things that we've heard all around the world. I no longer recognize my home. So how do we answer this knocking on the door? A lot of people are trying all kinds of bold experiments with their lifestyles, changing their diet, giving up flying, but you often are only scratching the problem with your lifestyle changes. If you lived in Arizona and you got an incredible rain harvester and you gave up swimming pools, 80% of the water in Arizona goes to agriculture. The entire industry has to change. You could try triple painting your windows, but most people don't own their homes, and the landlord is not going to change that for you unless the laws change. That requires all of society to stand together. Then we can start restructuring everything. We need totally new networks for transport, for energy production and distribution, and housing. For that, we need all hands on deck. These numbers, though, can drown you. It sounds like you are being overwhelmed by someone else's story. This is our story, and we have to take charge of it. And I'd like to explain how we can do that. The challenge right now, and I can tell you this as a scientist, we're trying to out-know each other and throw facts at each other when actually nobody knows, not scientists, not politicians, how to live with climate change. We're frozen like a deer in the headlights and not learning fast enough because we don't trust each other and we're not willing to take risky experiments. We have some examples now in Europe and the United States of people playing with doing things like removing the dikes and removing dams to allow rivers to flood. Australians are finally consulting with Aborigines for their 20,000 years of experience in burning landscapes on purpose to take the danger down before there's a catastrophe. These are the kind of innovations we have to experiment with to find out how we can live with this kind of disturbance. For that, we have to essentially stand together and take big risks. Now, my family knows that ominous knocking at the door. My own grandmother was forcibly evicted from her house in the middle of the night in 1940, and she never saw her home again in Poland. But that knocking on the door can be very different if society is united with goodwill. 2 years later in Moscow in 1942, that knock on the door did not mean that you might go to the Gulag. It meant the Nazi army is at the gates of the city and we need you out there now to help us fight it. And that same kind of goodwill that comes from a united society really benefited American soldiers 3 years later in France in 1945. One American army captain said, "My job as a soldier was a lot easier because often the Germans, when they saw we were Americans, would prefer to surrender because they knew we would give them a square deal." So how can we get to that? Many people who don't trust themselves often feel that the only way there is a charismatic leader like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who led the country during the Second World War. Sure, he was incredibly charismatic and was able to face down the biggest industrialist of the time, the head of General Motors. He said, "Sir, you're not listening to me. You are not going to be making cars. You're going to be making tanks and airplanes." Well, what was the real power behind his words? It wasn't the charisma. It was that all of society stood with him. So how can we now reach across the aisle and start uniting our society to achieve the kind of miracles that were achieved in the Second World War? Well, we can take the example of extremists who woke up and started coming back to the center of society. Many of them are helping other extremists to basically come back and start working with everybody. What they found is the first barrier, many extremists insulate themselves from their emotions by surrounding themselves with an armor of anger and hatred. We have to pierce that armor, not with facts. Hammering someone else with facts is counterproductive. It just raises the wall again. You hit them by going and touching their common humanity, friendship, family, a sense of that we need to do right by each other. The openness needed to do this, you have to trust yourself, and you have to also learn how to trust others and work with them. Trusting yourself can come from a practice like Zen Buddhism, though there are hundreds of paths to practice openness. This is not something you learn in a book. Openness is something that comes from doing it. You understand it because it is what you do, not because some book told you to. And the practice of working with others, we have centuries of experience in science in learning how to hold a question and look deeply into questions. Many people can see some contrast between religion and science, but actually Zen Buddhism and science meet in the same place, a profound and honest questioning. I've worked with Zen masters, I've worked with Nobel laureates in science, and the great ones share one characteristic. And that is an almost innocent humbleness that makes them totally approachable. They honestly care about you and honestly want to know how you feel. With someone like that, you could work on the thorniest of questions. Let me give you an example of how this works. Why was the first Nobel Prize in economics that a woman would take given to someone who wasn't even an economist? Elinor Ostrom was a political scientist, but she was open enough to test a question everyone had ignored for 50 years. That question is based on the assumption, how do we manage our environment when local people can't be trusted? They're selfish and ignorant, and they'll trash the environment. Elinor actually looked the first time, and she found all over the world, if local people were still united in their trust with each other, even without a formal education, they managed quite sustainably. Elinor heard the knocking on the door, and she didn't shy away from it. She actually opened the door and looked. We also, if we trust each other, can open the door and look and find ways to learn our way into the future. Then we'll see miracles like I saw in Western Sahara, where 200 million trees appeared out of nowhere in 15 years from people lacking formal education, but finally learned to trust one another and achieve miracles. We can do the same.
Can climate change cause health conditions? Dr. Nitin Damle believes they can. Dr. Damle is the past president of the American College of Physicians, a clinical associate professor of medicine at Brown University, and a founding member of the Medical Society's Consortium on Climate Change. Now, Dr. Domley has treated countless patients suffering from the health consequences of climate change. These illnesses, ranging from tick-borne illnesses and allergies to asthma and waterborne illnesses, are not uncommon or unique, but they have been occurring with increasing frequency over the past several years and disproportionately affect particular communities.
So I have 4 real-life stories to tell you today about the human health effects of climate change. So it was mid-August last year in South County on one of our hottest days. I was on call for the emergency room and got a call that one of my favorite elderly couple who lived in Peacedale and had no air conditioning and limited resources and family support were there with a high fever and confusion. They were suffering the effects of heat stroke. So we cooled them down and treated them with intravenous fluids and medication to lower their temperature. But they had underlying heart conditions, and the demand on the heart resulted in heart failure. They both unfortunately passed away despite our best efforts. More and more people are suffering from heat exhaustion, stroke, and even death, as in this couple. And it's from the increased frequency of heat waves in the United States. So my second story is one of a college runner who was having trouble staying on the team because she was having frequent episodes of wheezing and upper respiratory infections. She has asthma and multiple allergies. She was being treated with inhalers and other medications, but she still couldn't perform optimally. So more people are on costly medications and even steroids to keep their asthma and allergies under control. So we are seeing longer and more intense allergy seasons, from 177 days 10 years ago to 190 days today, and an increase in the levels of air pollution, with 7 million people in the world living in areas that exceed the World Health Organization limits on particulate matter. More people are seeking care in the office and in the emergency room at a cost of $11 billion per year for allergy care and $56 billion per year for asthma care. The third story is a patient of mine who went hiking in Arcadia this summer with some friends. He presented to the office with a rash and joint pains a few days later. He had Lyme disease and babesiosis. Both are tick-borne illnesses, and we've seen a 10-fold increase in their incidence in the past several years in New England. In addition, vector-borne illness like Zika and West Nile virus and Eastern equine encephalitis from tick bites, sandflies, or mosquitoes is significantly more common and a result of warming temperatures for longer periods around the world. My fourth story is a patient who went to a cilantro bar and about a day later developed diarrhea and abdominal pain. She was healthy, but had acquired a parasitic infection called Giardia from spoiled foods. We are seeing exponential growths in the number of viral, bacterial, and parasitic infections from a disruption in food production, shipment, and storage from farm to table due to increased temperature, flooding, extreme weather events. What is alarming is that the incidence of the 4 stories I shared with you are exponentially more common today than even a decade ago. In addition, we are seeing more food insecurity, effects on mental health, and mass migration around the world. Climate change affects our environment, our health, and quality of life. It disproportionately affects our most vulnerable populations: the elderly, the frail, the very young, the poor, and communities of color. The warming Earth leads to an increase in heat waves, air pollution, melting of Arctic ice, sea level rise, increased frequency and intensity of forest fires, frequent flooding, extreme weather events, and mass species extinction. It is not hyperbolic to say that if we don't act now, it will result in an uninhabitable Earth before the end of the century. So we have one last opportunity to save the planet and ourselves and mitigate the effects of climate change. We need to move to 100% clean renewable energy, that is wind, solar, hydrogen, and safe nuclear, within 20 years. We need to develop sustainable economic and financial incentive through innovation and green jobs. All nations need to commit to this through the Paris Accord and the upcoming COP26 agreements in November of 2021 in Glasgow, Scotland. You and me as individuals can make a difference in mitigating climate change. People are mobilizing all over the world. We need to spread the word with local, state, and national leaders, in your civic organizations, in our schools, colleges, and universities, about the effects of climate change on our health. We need to eat healthy, plant-based diets, use renewable energy, such as electric cars and solar panels for our homes. We need to plant a tree, commute less, walk, run, and bike, and lead healthy lives. So just ask yourself, which world do you want to live in? A world of famine, drought, heat waves, mass migration, violence, and air pollution? Or one of healthy diets, biking and hiking, clean energy buildings, electric cars, and national stability? Climate change and your health is a moral and ethical imperative. It's a political imperative, and it's an economic imperative. So as Margaret Mead said, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. So go do your part to save animals, plants, ourselves, and this precious earth, the only home we have ever known.
Ian Lin is an 11-year-old pianist, violinist, and composer. He's won many awards in piano competitions as well as music composition competitions. And he's the youngest member of the Rhode Island Philharmonic Youth Symphony Orchestra. He loves sharing music with others and gives annual solo concerts for seniors at a few nursing homes in Rhode Island. Wastewater is stinky, dirty, and a serious problem for human health and the environment. However, Dr. Vinka Oyana Del Craver is exploring the potential for transforming this residue into a resource. Vinka is a professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of Rhode Island. Her current research interests are in the area of emerging contaminants of drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater treatment, as well as the development of novel water technologies.
For me, the best part of summer is swimming in the bay. There is no better view than looking back at the coast floating from a distance. But as an environmental engineer, I cannot stop thinking about all the effort and resources we use to treat wastewater that we then dump into Narragansett Bay. I grew up in a coastal city in South America that sometimes I could not enjoy fully because of wastewater contamination. And because of this, I got interested to study on how to treat wastewater. I'm obviously biased, but I think wastewater treatment is one of the greatest inventions of our modern world. Thanks to it, we can prevent human diseases and damages to the environment. But early in my career, I was taught that wastewater is an undesirable residue, and the only thing that we can do is to treat it to reduce its negative impact. But things are changing. Climate change and depletion of resources are forcing us to think in a different way. There is not such a thing as waste, only stuff in the wrong place and in the wrong time. So my question today is how we can take the waste out of wastewater. So let's start with a little bit of a dirty talk. After you flush your toilet, take a shower, or wash your dishes, the water starts a fascinating transformation. If you live in an urban area, most likely the wastewater first is transported through miles and miles of underground tunnels to a facility that first removes the solids and then use an engineered natural process in which microorganisms eat tiny little particles and dissolve pollutants and grow and multiply so big that they can form flocks that they can be easily separated from the water, producing a cleaner water. But for this to happen, gigantic amount of air and energy are used to promote this process. And here's where things get interesting. Water and wastewater operation use over 2% or 70 million kilowatt hours of electricity only in the US. This is the same amount of electricity used by 7 million houses. Also, these facilities account for 5% of the greenhouse gases emission. Wastewater treatment can also be an economical burden to many communities. More strict regulation might require adding new processes, increasing the operational costs, and eventually, this extra cost need to be paid by somebody, most likely us, the consumer. We can certainly do better, but where is the opportunity here? What would you think if I tell you that wastewater contains as high as 5 times the energy we need to treat it? Wastewater has chemical energy stored in the organic matter and is about 1/3 of the total embedded energy. Remember that tiny little flocks of microorganisms that eat the pollutant? We can use them to produce biogas. This process is already used in some places, but more effort should be placed to make it a norm everywhere. Thermal energy is the largest portion of energy in wastewater, or about 2/3. After we use the water, wastewater is always warmer than the water that is entering our houses. The wastewater temperature is much warmer than the outdoor air in winter and much cooler during summer. So we could use this temperature difference to heat water or even in heating and cooling systems. Besides energy, wastewater can be a source of other materials as well. For example, drinking water. droughts and changes in rain pattern have driven the search for alternative sources of drinking water. There is a great interest and effort placed on using seawater for drinking water purposes. But did you know that there is more water in wastewater than in seawater? Seawater has 97% of water and 3% of salts and other compounds. On the other hand, wastewater is 99.9% water. This might seem a small difference to you, but when we're talking about treating millions and millions of gallons of water every year, the energy savings could be important. Nitrogen and phosphorus harvesting is another example of a benefit that might derive from wastewater. Our food supply relies on the use of synthetic nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizers. Their production accounts for over 1% of all the energy we use in the world. On the other hand, every year we use enormous amount of energy trying to remove nitrogen and phosphorus from wastewater to prevent algae bloom and low oxygen zones in coastal and freshwater systems. It seems great, but why are we not doing all of this? The problem is that in most cases, the technology available might not be economically attractive. Also, let's face it, wastewater is not hot on the public eye. For most, wastewater is out of sight and out of mind. We need to change our views on wastewater and increase our efforts to take advantage of all the hidden potential of wastewater. Doing this, we can transform this undesirable residue into a promised resource. So do me a favor. Next time you flush your toilet, think about the unwasted future of wastewater.
I'm going to talk to Dr. Mark Barnes at Morgan State University. He does a lot of work on geography and climate and environmental policy. And he's going to tell us about his work, but also how he brings this discussion to a much larger frame than we might expect, but then also how it comes down to a personal level, down to the ground level. He has all this knowledge, but how does it hit on a uniquely personal level? So let's talk to Mark.
How would you talk about climate change to someone that didn't know about climate change? But not only that, I said, where would you begin? Where would you begin? Because as you know, climate change has so many different dimensions, the physical dimensions, as well as the human dimensions, the economics, the political, right? All of that. And so I asked my students one day, so this is the story, one day, and this was like about week number 9 in the class, okay? And I had been talking about showing films of disproportionate impacts to poor and brown communities resulting from not only the actual events like flooding events, heat events in Chicago of 1995 that disproportionately impacted Black communities, neighborhoods in Chicago, as well as the Ninth Ward in Louisiana, right? And I've been having this conversation about disproportionate impacts, right? And they gave me the bovine stare for about 5 minutes. This is after about 9 weeks of constant, right, bombardment. And I'm sitting here like, are y'all kidding me? One brave soul raised her hand and said, well, Dr. Barnes, we don't talk about climate change. I said, okay, well, what are you all talking about? Well, we talk about injustice, and we talk about Black Lives Matter, right? That's what we talk about. And I said, go on. Go on. And, she kept speaking about that. And I said, well, I could tell you what the difference is between what you all see readily, like almost every day, on the news. I said the difference is that you have names associated with those who lost their lives. You also perhaps have names with those who committed the crime. But what you don't have is the millions of people who are suffering, again, disproportionately by these sorts of events and also the policies. You don't have those names, right? And so it's not sensationalized. So I understand that. In this case, when we talk about climate change, you can talk about justice, right? And in that sense, you know something about that, then you should know a little bit about climate change.
There's a memorial wall inside that story that does not exist.
That's right.
And that's almost heartbreaking, isn't it? That's a difficult image to look at.
Having that empathy, and that's something that I've shared also with students. Daniel Pink wrote a book that was titled A Whole New Mind. And he's talked about sort of the information age. And I guess that's what, the information age may represent sort of that scientific mind, if you will. But he also said, well, he talked about the senses. He talked about touch. He talked about taste, all of these things that allow us to experience our worlds, right? But he said, in thinking about, those senses, we can also use conceptual senses that allow us to negotiate and navigate ourselves in different spaces and be successful in that. And he talked about, these senses being empathy, play, design, story. He also talked about concert, meaning working together collaboratively. And then he also spoke about meaning. And I think that's what we have to always search for. We have to search for the meaning. And I think that allows us to have those uncomfortable, necessary conversations. At least 3 out of those 6 concepts are, for me, empathy, story, and meaning. So when you think about at least having these conversations, not everyone is going to be moved today. The message needs to be consistent and constant. Eventually, that person in the future will receive that message, will receive that book of names.
What would our oceans look like without oxygen? Veronique Oldham is an assistant professor of oceanography at URI's Graduate School of Oceanography. She completed her PhD in oceanography at the University of Delaware and earned a postdoctoral scholarship at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. Now, Veronique will introduce us to 3 chemical reactions that changed the course of history and shaped our chemical world as we know it.
Oxygen. It's all around us, we breathe it, couldn't get by without it. Frankly, maybe we take it for granted. Can you imagine a world without it? Well, take off that imagination hat and look no further than our oceans, because there's a world without oxygen developing right now. And alarmingly, many regions are losing oxygen at a rapidly increasing rate. You may have heard of them. They have names like oxygen minimum zone, hypoxic region, anoxic basin, or chillingly, dead zone. Today I'm going to refer to them as dead zones just for the drama. These oceanic dead zones have quadrupled in size since 1950 and have increased tenfold in coastal areas, We've already lost 77 billion tons of oxygen in our oceans. When water loses oxygen, organisms suffocate, just like humans would if our atmosphere suddenly lost all of its oxygen. In these dead zones, most marine organisms can't survive. Some fish have adapted to be able to swim away, but many organisms don't have that luxury. Slow-moving organisms, organisms at the bottom of the seafloor, and many larvae are organisms that can't swim away when dead zones set in. We're talking things like crabs, we're talking lobster, we're talking anemones, we're talking beautiful corals, thousands of zooplankton species and larvae. Like, how cute is this guy? Can we not suffocate him, please? Can you imagine the chaos if this happened on land? Imagine if whole cities lost oxygen. Where would people go? What if everyone from Florida had to suddenly move to Alaska and they weren't adapted to that? They probably don't even have a winter coat. That's what happens to fish too. When they lose their homes, they aren't necessarily suited to living somewhere new. To understand these oceanic dead zones and to start a conversation about fixing this problem, we really need to take a step back and do some chemistry. I know, you're all probably really psyched to do chemistry. Well, today we're going to discuss 3 important chemical reactions. The first one, probably really familiar to all of you. The second one, maybe the most impressive chemical innovation of human history. And the third one, well, that's a surprise. All right, let's start by examining chemical reaction number 1. And to do that, we have to go back a little bit in time. 3.5 billion years ago, our oceans were totally void of oxygen. Microscopic life did exist and was able to survive on other elements like iron and sulfur. But then, something chemical happened. About 2.3 billion years ago, some little microscopic dudes were like, hey, let's make some oxygen. And they uncovered what I think is the most important chemical reaction on the planet, photosynthesis. These little ones were able to take carbon dioxide, water, light, and boom, they make oxygen and sugar. Pretty good deal. Since they didn't actually need the oxygen, it accumulated in our oceans and in our atmosphere. Without this chemical reaction, there wouldn't be life on Earth as we know it, and there certainly wouldn't be us on this planet. Okay, let's fast forward. Here we are in 1910. 2 handsome, sprightly German dudes named Haber and Bosch changed the world. They developed what may be the most important chemical manufacturing process on the planet, the production of ammonia fertilizer. They did something remarkable. They took nitrogen, which is the dominant element in our atmosphere, and combined it with hydrogen from petroleum to make NH3 or ammonia, commonly known as fertilizer. You know where they got their inspo? Nature, of course. Microorganisms known as diazotrophs have been doing it for years. Honestly, nature should just win the Nobel Prize every time. Anyways, so these 2 dudes invent fertilizer, and this process fed millions of people worldwide. The Haber-Bosch reaction is thought to be responsible for a tremendous spike in the global population and an increase worldwide in agriculture. But what they didn't consider, and what many of us still don't, is what happens to that fertilizer after we use it on our crops. Let's look at the US. The Mississippi Drainage Basin is the 3rd largest drainage basin in the world after the Amazon and the Congo. It passes through America's heartland, collecting massive quantities of nitrogen fertilizer along the way, which all winds up in the Gulf of Mexico. The fertilizer in the Gulf of Mexico does the same thing in the ocean as it does on land. It makes things grow. When algae in the ocean receive too much fertilizer, they grow incredibly fast. They grow so fast that large swaths of algae block oxygen from the atmosphere from reaching the ocean. And when they die, their mass decomposition consumes an additional ton of oxygen. This is what causes dead zones in coastal oceans. The dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico is the 2nd largest in the world at over 9,000 square miles. It's estimated that every year, the fishing industry of the Gulf of Mexico loses $2.4 billion as a result of this dead zone. This type of dead zone is cropping up everywhere, including our very own Narragansett Bay. The Narragansett Bay is experiencing critically low bottom water oxygen levels, which you may have noticed if you've ever seen smelly black ooze near, say, Watch Hill or Sandy Point. While it's not a dead zone yet, this is where we're headed. The Narragansett Bay fishing industry supports a variety of fish, like the black sea bass, the flounder, scup, striped sea bass, and menhaden. It's worth an estimated $412 million a year and supports over 4,000 jobs. To change our course and to protect systems like the Narragansett Bay and Gulf of Mexico, I want to turn your attention to our third and final chemical reaction. It's chemical innovation. I know, it's not the silver bullet you were hoping for. But trust me, using scientific innovation and nature as inspiration, we can find a chemical solution to the chemical problem that we've started. Remember that hottie Haber? Well, he once said the following about his nitrogen reaction. It may be that this solution is not the final one. Nitrogen bacteria teach us that nature, with her sophisticated forms of chemistry of living matter, still understands and utilizes methods which we do not yet know how to imitate. And so that's where we are today. We don't need to imagine an ocean without oxygen, because it's arriving. What we need to do with our imagination instead is to work on a solution for reoxygenating our oceans. We need to put our faith in science. We need to trust human innovation. We desperately need to work together. We can save nature by looking to nature for inspiration, because nature had it right in the first place. So let's learn by listening, watching, and creating.
Hi, I'm Carl Aspeland. In a moment, I'm going to have a conversation with Mary Grace Almendras, Associate Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer at the University of Rhode Island. She's going to bring us a view on the climate crisis that relates to the female experience. She's going to show us 3 points and connect the dots between women, water, and food. And from there, she's going to show us how maybe we can, each of us, work toward caring for our Mother Earth in the way that we think about caring for our families and the way that our kitchen table is where we need to really think about these things.
When we look at the privatization of water, how does that impact communities and women in particular? So we're looking at sort of corporations coming into communities that say, this is our water, and people of that community and women in particular who are often charged with collecting that water and may not have easy access to potable water, to now have to travel great distances with the hopes that they're getting water that they can bring back to their families. In particular for those communities that don't have means, for example, to collect rainwater or other means of potable water. And so when we look at the ways in which women are impacted, their labor in particular, and perhaps even exploitation of that labor and not understanding what it takes physically to collect that water and then bring it back to the communities for hygiene, for cooking, perhaps for farming. And then how does that impact their families and their communities? If they're worried about their water, that may impact their healthcare or lack thereof if they don't have access to water. If they're not healthy, they're not able to get the education they need to empower their communities. And so when it's women oftentimes in rural communities that have to do that collection and we're not connecting those dots, we don't realize, for example, the disparate impact of women. I grew up in California. And a lot of the farming and the produce that is done in California actually spreads out to the rest of the country. And I also, lived most recently in San Francisco before moving here to Providence. And I noticed that the big thing in the Bay Area was going to Napa for the weekend, this romanticized notion of what it meant to go to the wineries. But then I look at who's farming those lands and whose labor and backs are toiled for the production of that wine, for the production of that food. While the majority of the numbers are indeed men, we know that women in particular are vulnerable in these communities, particularly if they're working in larger sheds or living in larger sheds rather, and their living conditions may not be necessarily stellar. So women in particular are vulnerable in those spaces, both because numerically they're smaller, but also they're more vulnerable to issues related to abuse and perhaps even sexual abuse and harassment. Then we have the children involved. And when we think about how gender is stratified within the United States, we still, Even if we have dual career couples in a heterosexual couple, it's still primarily women who are still charged with the nurturing of their families. So I think about the toil and the labor of women, farm workers, the campesinas, for example, who are working in those farms, working in those wineries, collecting that food, and still charged with making sure that their families are taken care of and that there's food on the table. And so when I look at climate, I also think about, farming, the farming industry and the impact that that has. I would drive through the cattle ranches. I would drive through the farming. I would drive through side of the road stands. I would see all this. I would see who was working the fields. I would see who was purchasing the produce. It didn't look like people who were working the fields. So they didn't even get to enjoy the fruits of their labor. I think about my own experience, and actually the painting behind me depicts a Filipino value called bayanihan. And it's a painting of a village coming together to actually carry a neighbor's hut from one part of the village to another. That's often during rainy season. So actually moving the hut on bamboo poles on top of the shoulders of men, particularly from the ocean to inland, right, to protect them from the monsoons. It's a sense of social responsibility, doing for one's neighbor. It was everyday life in the way in which my family and community had ubiquitous messages of what it meant to have a sense of social responsibility, to have an ethic of care for people within the community that extended beyond my immediate family. But how do we have a sense of social responsibility and understand how our individual actions can make a huge difference in our community? We can talk about issues of climate from a very academic and scholarly perspective, but what's important to note is the people on the ground. How is this going to impact the day-to-day lives of the mothers who still have to put food on their table and to ensure that their families are taken care of and that they have access to healthy food and have access to education and healthcare? As we think about a community of learned people, formally educated people, to also understand the impact it has at the very basic unit, the family, the ways in which we can translate information that's very intellectual, again, can become this sort of exercise of exploring various options and people who choose to be activists, but to understand how that impacts people in their day-to-day lives.
Rebecca Millsop is a lecturer in ethics at the University of Rhode Island and is co-founder of the organization Philosophers for Sustainability. As a professional philosopher, her goal is to organize with colleges across the world to envision and fight for a more sustainable future. Now, in this program, she'll be asking the question, what kind of life should I live?
So as a teaching philosopher, I hope to help my students see how philosophy can operate as a tool in their actual lives outside of the classroom. And I think that this can apply to anyone out there watching as well. So one way that I think that we can use philosophy to address this crisis is that it can help us be honest with ourselves about where we're at and help us get motivated to find realistic avenues for change. So this crisis is just so overwhelming. The more you learn about it, the more helpless that you can feel. And that's legitimate. You out there will never fix the climate crisis. That's not the kind of problem that we're facing. So it can feel sometimes like there's nothing for you to do at all. And maybe it's easiest to just go on living your life, not thinking about it and not changing anything. But instead of that route, we can engage in rigorous, honest questioning about the kind of lives that we live and the kind of lives we actually need to live in a world that is adequately addressing the crisis. Another way relates to how philosophers have been thinking about the differences between types of things for a very, very long time, and then using these observations to construct theories. Some of these, at least, can be applied to practical situations. So it can help to draw on the work of these philosophers to clarify the nature of things and apply that clarity to our current dilemma. So this is what I think that philosophers can bring to the table, and I'm one of those. I've been studying teaching and doing philosophy for over 15 years now. 4 of these have been working with students at URI in the philosophy department. So a particular distinction that I think can be helpful to us all is the difference between unrestrained agency and constrained agency, where agency is the capacity to act. So agency is going to be unrestrained when a person can act as they please without any pushback whatsoever. But agency is constrained when someone wants to act in a certain way, but cannot due to barriers that they might run into. So a lot of traditional theorizing about responsibility assumes that all individuals can utilize their personal agency to address their wrongdoings whenever they'd like. This, however, is completely unrealistic. So think of a mother living in Rhode Island. She's the breadwinner for her family. She teaches middle school somewhere else in the state and has to drive to work every day because there isn't a reliable public transportation available to her. Her car is a gas guzzler because she can't afford a new hybrid car. She can't change jobs because, well, she needs the health insurance for her family, and she's still paying off student debt that she accrued to get the job that she has now. She is very aware of the climate crisis and also how her individual actions contribute to it. So what should she do? Well, on the traditional unrestrained agency picture, she should be able to just change her actions, fix her wrongdoings. And if she doesn't, then perhaps she's being a bad person or doing the wrong thing. But I think we can ask if she is really to blame. And I'd argue no. Her ability to change her actions is constrained by multiple factors, none of which are her fault. The price of hybrid vehicles, or the lack of a reliable, expansive public transportation system, or the fact that health insurance is dependent on employment. None of these things are her fault. So her agency is constrained by policies and structures that are way beyond her control. And this is true for all of us in different ways. And at the same time, we have all, for the most part, been trained to believe in this unrestrained agency picture. We're taught that it's all on us. We have to do it alone. So you can see how we might feel helpless when we realize that by just recycling our glass bottles, we can't change the world. So you may now respond, well, my agency is constrained. I can't fix the problem at all. I guess I'll just go on living my life, not doing anything. But that is not the right response. We are constrained, but we can still work from where we are, find the power that we do have to work towards change. I think it's important to go beyond single individual actions to ways that we can integrate a practice of change into our lives overall. And this is where I think it's helpful to turn to the work of 2 incredible philosophers, Iris Marion Young and Robin Zhang. They both advocate for finding where your power lies and building on that power to advocate for larger changes. So Young argues that we should engage in collective action to push for large-scale changes. Here, she is thinking about working together, getting involved in the political process, joining actively engaged organizations, continuing to educate ourselves, and helping educate others. Zhang, on the other hand, agrees that collective action is important, but she urges us to integrate this change into all aspects of our lives by pushing on our social roles. So a social role is a set of expectations that apply to a person and their specific relationships to others. So one of my social roles is as college instructor. So I am expected to act in a certain way in relationship to my students and my colleagues. So all of us have multiple social roles. So Zhang is encouraging us to push on these, to create, and again, expect large-scale changes. So you can ask yourself, how can you push on your role as a parent or a business owner or a student? I, as an academic philosopher, another one of my social roles, can engage my colleagues in conversation about how our profession negatively affects climate change. And then we can go beyond conversation to create ways of changing these behaviors, to expect this of our profession. So this fits within my social role, but it also pushes on its boundaries to affect change. So you might wonder, what does this mean for us watching this? Well, given everything that I've talked about, I think there are a few concrete steps that you can take. First, recognize that your individual actions can make small changes, but they are not going to fix the larger scale issue. This will require you to find and utilize your power in more far-reaching ways. You can first identify what your social roles are and find ways to push on them. Be honest with yourself about your power. If you have a lot, then utilize it. If you don't, you can find ways to work with others to create more power. And here is where Iris Marion Young comes in. Join organizations to get powerful with others. There's so much great work being done, even here in our wonderful state. You don't have to have a lot of power to join an organization, but working with one immediately increases your power. And another way to utilize philosophy is to practice honest and expansive questioning. Philosophers think expansively about possibilities. And the hard, honest truth is that a lot of things are going to have to dramatically change about our world if we're going to adequately fight this crisis. This means that we all need to start thinking expansively about what the world could look like and how your life could change. You may end up finding yourself in situations where you say, well, that's just impossible. Ask yourself, is it really impossible? Or will it just be really difficult? Really difficult things can be addressed and overcome with big, creative, expansive thinking and working together. Finally, normalize this way of thinking by engaging in open discussions with the people in your life. The bottom line is that we are responsible, and the only way that things are going to change is if we all start from right where we're at, and if we do this work together. So I would recommend be honest, think expansively, push on your social roles, and engage in collective action to create the kind of big change that's necessary to address this crisis.
Amy Gautau was born in South Carolina and is a Japanese-American cellist. She began playing the cello at the age of 3. She made her debut as soloist with the Charleston Symphony Orchestra at age 9. In 2015, she received the Hope Award at the 9th International Tchaikovsky Competition for Young Musicians held in Russia. She was a featured performer on NPR's show From the Top in 2018, and most recently, she competed as the youngest contestant at the Mazzacurati competition in Turin, Italy, in the fall of 2019. Amy is also a recipient of a scholarship from the Joy Conservatory at the University of Connecticut since fall 2017, and she currently resides in Rhode Island.
Hi, I'm Carl Asplund. I'm about to speak to Loren Spears. Loren is a member of the Narragansett tribe and the executive director of the Tomahawk Museum in Exeter. Loren is also a graduate of the University of Rhode Island, and she's going to speak to us about climate change as seen from the perspective of Indigenous people. I'm looking forward to a very interesting conversation.
Indigenous people have been the first that have really felt climate change. It was almost 20 years ago, the first time I heard the words climate change. And it wasn't in a TEDx. It wasn't on some Zoom screen. It wasn't on a TV show. It was at literally at Brown University. They had invited an elder from an Indigenous community in the northernmost parts of Canada. But I remember I went to the talk with my mother, and I remember us sitting there, and this was not a fancy talk, no PowerPoint, nothing. But it was so powerful because this elder stood up there and described the changes in the land, the changes in the water, the changes that were impacting the animals, impacting the seasons, impacting their lifeways, impacting their traditions. And it made us start reflecting on how things have changed here and the things that our elders are saying about the changes in the land. Indigenous voices are there and have continued to be there and have continued to be at the forefront of this fight for equity, environmental equity. It's just erased from the public landscape. It's not that it's not there, it's just erased from the mainstream portals. If you think of things like Standing Rock that finally made it into the mainstream news and things like that, but it took a lot to get that to happen. Children and families and communities, you know, people think it's cliche when they say water is life. Nipana Kitiawank, water is life. That's in our language. You know, it's literally a truth, but yet people are not taking it seriously. If we as humans do not have clean drinking water, we cannot survive. We have a history of injustice against Indigenous people, you know, through conquest and colonization and land dispossession, and the list goes on. But in this 21st century, we're having injustice in that pipelines aren't put into the wealthy environments. They're put in brown, Indigenous, Black, and poor environments. And whether it's right or wrong, that's not the point. The point is it's economical for them to plow right through these spaces. And they don't really care whether it's at the detriment of Indigenous and poor and people of color communities, because those are not valued. Environmental justice equals or is Indigenous rights and vice versa. The reality is we do live in a global world. This pandemic shows that. And we can't just think about our own location. We have to think about the whole entire world. And how can we combat the vast changes that are happening, that are human-made changes? If it's human-made changes, then we can make decisions that mitigate those changes. I don't know if we can undo what we've done, but we can mitigate what we've done and slowly heal these processes that will give us some balance. Balance is always making sure you're giving back what you're taking. You know, when we grow the three sisters, there's this symbiotic relationship between the corn, the bean, and the squash. You know, it's not just between the three of them, but also between the land and the water and the sea, because you put fish and seaweed in the soil to give nutrients and sustenance to the land. You know, of course, fresh water is raining down to give it the hydration that it needs. The corn is growing up straight and tall, giving the bean a place to be. The bean is giving nutrients and nitrogen back into the soil. The squash leaves or pumpkin leaves, They're growing very big in order to keep moisture in the ground and to keep the weeds down. They all have their job, and there's this symbiotic relationship that creates a balance that ensures the sustenance and sustainability of our people. My grandmother, I actually am wearing my grandmother today. I must have her spirit with me. My grandmother lived to be 100. And I'm like, well, if I can live to be 100, she was almost 101. She was just a few weeks shy of 101 when she passed over. And the blessing that she gave me in our lives are so many. And I think that if we listen to the elders and their wisdom and we apply some of that today, we could all be in a better place. And so I think that she did everything in her life to ensure that I could have the best life that I have, and she saw great grandchildren. And that's an amazing life. And I hope to live that. And that means that we have to have clean air. We have to have clean water. We have to have reasonable housing. We have to have food. We have to have food systems that can sustain us, that give us healthy, nutritious food to eat. When you think about balance and living in balance with the ecosystems in which we're from, we've done that really well for millennia. And yet, for a very short period of time, we've managed to destroy it as humans. And so I think that there's a lot to learn from indigenous ways of knowing.
Today, I will highlight the role of the oceans in Earth's climate. I deliver this testimony from Narragansett, Rhode Island, the traditional land of the Narragansett tribal nation. I deliver this testimony to the U.S. government centered in Washington, D.C., the homeland of the Nacotchtank or Anacostan people. I honor their histories and ancestors and perseverance in our communities today, as our communities were built on Indigenous land. We acknowledge the Indigenous people and honor their stewardship of the land, sea, and resources that they hold sacred. The fourth National Climate Assessment, Volume 2, highlights the disproportionate impact of climate change on Indigenous communities. This threat is highlighted in IPCC's special report on oceans and cryosphere in 2019. And is especially relevant to our discussion today, as social and environmental justice must be central to our climate strategies and solutions. For the last 7 years, Earth's global average temperature has been the warmest on record.
I'm waiting for Dr. Paula Bontempi to finish her testimony at a congressional hearing. She's testifying there on the science behind the impacts of the climate crisis. And we're going to meet with her once she's done in a couple of hours. She'll come right here. We're setting up some chairs. The really interesting thing on a personal level here is that Dr. Bontempi graduated from the Graduate School of Oceanography here at URI 20 years ago. And after a little bit of a stint elsewhere, she was in the Earth Science Division at NASA for 16 years as a scientist. Then she directed that division for 2 years as the acting director before coming here, and is now the dean of the Graduate School of Oceanography at URI. And so once she's done with her hearing, we're going to ask her a little bit about that and see what that all might mean, maybe on a local level. There we go.
Right.
Hello, Paula.
Hello.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
Okay. How's your day been?
So far, so good.
Well, I was up here watching the hearing. What would you have thought that I should learn from that? I'm in the arts. I'm in the humanities. What should I have learned from that?
It's funny. I would ask you, what you learned from it,
yeah,
right? Right. Okay. Yeah. So I mean, I'm not sure. What's really difficult about these hearings, and this is something I feel very strongly about in science, and I think I might have even said this. I certainly put it in my testimony, right? Is that we are so crappy at telling our stories. We are really bad at it. I'm not saying unilaterally, universally, every single scientist I know is bad at it. But this idea of adding science communication or storytelling on as a punchline at the end, that final chapter, is not what we need to do in science. It doesn't matter what kind of science you do, right? Because if we're not reaching people, then, I think the potential impact of our science,
falls by the wayside. It might land in a couple of certain places, but look at the way that in the hearing, the individual congressfolk presented their story. I'm from Michigan. I'm from the Great Plains. I'm from this area. I'm from California. I'm from this district in New Jersey that was super hit hard by Hurricane Sandy. They're thinking about the relevance of the hearing to their backyard and what's happened in their backyard to the global climate crisis, right? What I would want you to take away is, did you learn something about the climate crisis? The connections to the energy sector were pretty heavy in that hearing. And less on the, is climate change occurring, which seemed really nice that didn't come up, although it did in subtext from a couple of the questions, right? So I would have wanted you to hear, where the nature of the questions originated, right? Like, where is that coming from, and understand those individual members' stories. Because I think if you do that, then you start to understand how to answer those questions and what you should care about and how you engage your stakeholders.
You brought up very quickly the concept of climate literacy. And I've been teaching for 30 years. My wife is a 7th grade teacher. And you specifically picked up on the K through 8. You mentioned you have a 4th grader yourself.
Mm-hmm. I will say that I will preface my answer by saying one thing that really struck me about my answer is that it was totally centered on a white person's view. And it struck me like a half an hour later that my answer was completely originated in sort of this like white privilege aspect. Mm-hmm. And I was like, have I learned nothing? Do I not pay attention enough? And why do I say that? I say that because I made the comment about my son, his friends, for the most part, being really engaged, really connected, electronic savvy, just very focused on their role in the world. And then it struck me later, like, what about low wealth, low resource communities who don't have access to things that we have access to? Maybe they're just concerned about food and not their role in the earth system, right? So we need to make sure, like I think about this in the context of GSO. I had to do this analysis recently where we looked at, in our curriculum, in our classes, do we teach anything like the social aspect of the environmental science that we do? And there were probably 2 classes where we could identify it does come up in like a class or 2, not a whole semester course. I was like, okay, that's a huge oversight on our part, but maybe we don't have the faculty or the lecturers to teach that, right, at the graduate level. So if we're not teaching it at the graduate level, are we even thinking about it at the K through 4, the K through 8, the high school level? And the one thing that I see really resonates with my son and his friends is that experiential hands-on learning, right? So enabling them to engage in that dialogue in some meaningful way by hands-on demonstration of things like climate change or environmental change. Letting the students at any age actually tell you how they're feeling about climate, about the environment, about things they saw. I'll tell you, there was something one of the congresspeople said that I was like, I would croak if my son's teacher told him that. And she said, why should we bother doing anything in the United States of America when India and the People's Republic of China are just going to go about their business? What difference does it make? And I was like, I would be so pissed if somebody said that to my son, because what? It's okay to throw your trash out the window because you're just one person. And what dent is that really going to make in the local, litter problem? Or it's okay to dump your trash in the ocean because you're just one person. And what difference is that? Like, that is just such what's wrong with our world in some sense right now is that people don't see their role in the bigger picture. They just see their role in the here and now. And I want that long range, long arc story of climate and its impacts, what's happening now, how what we do today could affect Narragansett Bay ecosystems and how that has a direct impact on the blue economy in the state. And if one person says, well, it doesn't matter if I change, and then the next person says that, how are we ever, going to be resilient to what's happening around us? And that's what I want people to think about when they think about climate, is their role.
So tell me what to do. All right, you don't want to tell somebody else what to do. Tell me what to do.
Yeah.
What do you want me to do now, next week, with my classes? What do I do?
What's a class that you teach, Carl?
Introduction to Design.
Introduction to Design. Perfect. Okay. How do people think climate and design intersect? We've so designed our classes for the most part to fit in those boxes of I have to teach you chapter 1, 2, 3, that we never really have those dialogues as much as we could or should maybe to engage with students like that. So I'd be curious to see what your students would say. Would they think about sustainable development, cloth and textiles and recycling, secondhand clothing? What would come to mind? Is it even just clothing? Is it art? Is it, materials that we use in our daily creations?
So in this TEDx program that we're wrapping up here, we have a medical doctor, we have a philosopher, we have a couple of ocean scientists, we have a textile chemist. If we brought all these speakers into one room with you, what's your instruction to the group of what they should talk about now?
To me, I want to hear what they have to say. How do I garner ideas about where we want to go as a community if I can't listen to what people have to say about what's on their mind?
But what's the question?
The question is, what are the most pressing issues you think in climate based on your knowledge of your field? Do you think about the environment when you do your day-to-day work? I know what the oceanographers are going to say, but I don't know the perspective that they'll bring to it. Having a doctor hearing what they're thinking about, having somebody in textiles hearing what they're thinking about, a philosopher, that'd be great. I think that would open up whole new areas of interdisciplinary science.
So who would you most like to have a conversation with?
In my lifetime?
Yeah. You get to choose the person
I've never
to have a
thought about
conversation
this.
with about climate.
Probably I would love to talk about this with somebody like Martin Luther King. His reach, his story, his message, his knowledge, what he was sensitive to, how he saw the big picture. When I was at NASA somewhere in the late 10s, our administrator then, Charlie Bolden, put out this message on Martin Luther King Day where he quoted Martin Luther King and his perspective on science. And it was just so inclusive. And I don't mean just in the human sense. I mean in just the way he looked at exploration of, our solar system and things like that. So he thought about it, of all the things on somebody like that's mind. He brought in all these different perspectives and simple things he would say. So I would love to have a conversation with somebody like that.
Hello, my name is Maling Ibrahimpour. I'm the Dean of the College of Business at the University of Rhode Island. Thank you for watching the TEDxURI Decoding the Language of Climate. I hope you took away a few nuggets from our presenters about the climate from a variety of perspectives. As the organizer of the TEDxURI, my main job is to put a team together and start the process. Before I introduce the greatest team that I ever worked with, allow me to thank the provost of the university, who with his generous support made this event possible. Thank you, Provost DeHaze, for your continuous support of TEDxURI. Now, the best team that I had the honor and privilege to work with. Let me introduce them to you. Our curators, Paolo McGlison, Carl Asplund, and Vince Petronio. Our production and post-production members are Alex DeCiccio, Ethan Hicks, Gavin DiFranco, Katie Babula, Max Ponticelli, Ryan Campos, Melly Hayes, Jamie Default. And our communication members are Aaron Spears, Heather Colby, Brander Fuller, and Sean Holt. And we have a series of supporters that support us all the way. And they are Carmen Rogers, Christine Andrews, Peg Boyd, Jessica Lenekes, Susan McClintock, and Lori Giacolucci. Without this great team, we would not have been able to bring this great production to you. Thank you, team, for your hard work and dedication. to our audience. I hope to see you next year at our next year's TEDx event. Thank you so very much.